Hi, everybody. My name is Alex Zavell, and I'm here in the beautiful Jack London area of Oakland, California at Gateway Incubator. And I'm hopefully about to have what should be a good discussion this morning with my friends and guests, Ben and Carter. And we're here for Gateway Office Hours.
All right. Good job,
Awesome.
man.
See, you can do the intro anytime you want,
Yeah,
Alex.
I'm a big fan of being a guest on your show.
Yeah. So, welcome.
Thank you.
for
Thank you for
coming.
having me,
Yeah.
seriously.
Can we pimp you out a little bit? Like, Alex, Robert Raich is I think he's like one of the most well-known cannabis lawyers in the state. Is that correct? Is that?
Yeah, I mean, since he argued the Supreme Court cases to consider the issue, I'd say, and one of them actually bears his name because his wife at the time was a party to the case. So since then, and a lot of the work he's done otherwise, you could say that's accurate.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. So, and Alex works for you guys works for Robert, and yeah.
Yeah, and I just know that, like, anytime I have a legal question, you're the guy I call. And we've been getting a lot of legal questions lately because, well, the impending election and just the excitement of building businesses and people wondering where they should go and all that. So I think it's a great time to have you on, and yeah, excited to just start picking your brain.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. So where do
So-
you want to start us off?
Well, I want to start off with you, just because, some of the people out there, this might be the first time they're seeing you on camera. Maybe they aren't catching, the local news or anything like that when you're up there fighting for the cause. But, just let people know, like, kind of what you're involved with, what's coming down the pipeline, what keeps you busy.
Yeah, absolutely. I work as my day job at a law firm here in Oakland, as Carter mentioned, with an attorney named Robert Raich, and we also have a number of other attorneys at our office. I'm not an attorney myself, but I've worked there for 6 years, since about 2010.
Honorary attorney, in my book.
Fair enough. Well, there is something called, the state bar that sort of determines if you actually count as an attorney or not. So I don't technically, I'm not admitted to the bar, nor have I gone to law school, but at the firm, I do a lot of our firm's sort of policy work. So my title is Senior Regulatory Analyst. I've, done a fair bit of prior to sort of immediately doing the policy work, done a lot of work with our clients in terms of being a sort of corporate paralegal for years, but for the last 2 years, I've really started to focus on state policy, sort of the regulations that are going to be coming down pursuant to these new state laws that we'll be operating under, and then also, both the new medical regulations we have and Prop 64, the Adult Use of Marijuana Act, really make local governments the gatekeepers of the entire process of licensing the cannabis supply chain. They have ultimate discretion over what activity occurs within their boundaries, and so really working with those bodies to understand the changing regulation is a big part of my role. So that's a lot of my work at the firm. I also work with a couple other organizations sort of outside of that context. So I'm a policy advisor to the California Growers Association, and help sort of work to organize a number of the sort of regional chapters of that. So for example, I'm part of the leadership team of the Oakland San Francisco chapter of it. I work with, as well, sort of an organization called the National Cannabis Bar Association, which is an attorney trade group for attorneys specializing in cannabis law around the country. And so, of course, I'm not an attorney, but I help sort of bring that together through my firm. And actually, I chair the local policy and regulation committee of that organization. So working with attorneys, across the country to sort of build resources to provide services to those businesses that are operating in this space. And it's, I think, sort of scratches the surface of some of it.
Scratches the surface. So I got an immediate question for you. When do you sleep? I mean, that's a lot going on, and right now I can only imagine that it's really, really busy for you.
Well, I mean, there's a lot going on right now in this space and in this field, and it's a really sort of exciting time. It feels like there's really almost an infinite amount of things that you can pour your time into that will give you sort of real return in terms of, just actually be valuable investments of your time. And, it is something that I feel really fortunate to be able to work on, because it actually, I think, gives me, it's not draining. It's something that actually is stimulating and energizing, seeing sort of this whole area of law and policy change rapidly before our eyes, and being able to be a part of that, if not a small part, with a community of people really making a big impact on it, is actually something that gives me a lot of energy. So,
yeah.
Cool. I mean, I think you're one of the most knowledgeable people about cannabis. I mean, I'm sending people to you all the time. Case in point, we had a question from one of our incoming cohort companies that I sent to you.
Right.
And actually, yesterday I just told them just watch the show because we're just going to ask. But
a little bit of free non-legal advice here.
Yeah, yeah.
The fact that you aren't a lawyer and that you get to say that before you say anything, it kind of means you can't get in trouble, right?
Right.
We'll not get into the technicalities, but yeah.
I say you can't get in trouble. There you go.
Thank you.
Ben indemnifies you.
Yes.
Andy.
Great.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of questions. So the guys we're talking to want to bring down a small grow, more of a research grow, and not technically research. They're building. They're basically building a business that will supply seeds and clones and that kind of stuff to people. So they're not a huge grow, but they were looking at jurisdictions, great, because they're coming from way up north, and they're trying to figure out, okay, if we come down to the Bay Area, where can we do this, and where are the regulations favorable? When we started Gateway, we were very pro Oakland, and we're married to Oakland at this point, so we have to say nice things about Oakland. But we're starting to have a little bit of trepidation about Oakland's local ordinances, and so we've seen some of the sausage being made in the politics locally. Where can you just kind of give an overview of maybe a few jurisdictions in the Bay Area and what you think their policies are, or where they're going? And
maybe to sort of give more context to that, I think it might be helpful to sort of speak to the challenge facing local governments and the local issues and sort of what they're working through and what contributes to a jurisdiction being favorable or not, and sort of historically what's done so, and then also what will make a jurisdiction welcoming to this industry going forward. And so I think that, and then I can talk about a few specific examples of that. But really, I think it's important to note, California is the oldest medical cannabis state. Medical cannabis was authorized by the voters here back in '96, 2 decades ago, with the passage of Prop 215. However, until last year, when the legislature passed the Medical Cannabis Regulation and Safety Act, there was really no comprehensive state regulation of this industry. Individual sort of patient consumers, are familiar with being able to go to dispensaries and have been able to do that for some time. But really, from a sort of legal regulatory perspective, there hasn't been a lot of clear guidance as to how this industry will sort of operate, and sort of the rules that it must operate by specifically. Prop 215 was a very sort of narrow policy. It fit on the front of a piece of paper. It was really not comprehensive whatsoever. It didn't contemplate an industry. It really just dealt with individual patients, doctors, and caregivers for those patients, and sort of the narrow rights that they had as individuals, but didn't talk about businesses whatsoever. And that left local governments in a really difficult position for all these years. They've been saying for years, we want more guidance from the state about how we regulate this industry, because businesses pop up, but there isn't clear sort of roadmap for these local governments to follow. So for years, really, a local jurisdiction's the degree to which it was a good place to be a medical cannabis business was really about sort of the attitudes of the local government. There wasn't really too much in the way of formal permitting. We've seen some formal permitting for dispensaries only, but really especially the production side of the industry, the supply chain, is something that's really been sort of not really spoken to at all by local laws. It's as if local governments really, they permit the dispensary, but all the products on the shelves, it's as if it falls like divine mana, divine mana onto the shelves. And where did that come from? There isn't sort of any formal structure for that. So really, what happened then with over the last 20 years, there have been numerous attempts to try and impose a state regulatory framework, but there hasn't really been the ability to reach consensus. There's various stakeholders, some notable ones being law enforcement. Local governments themselves have a big presence in Sacramento, and we're sort of skeptical early on of medical cannabis and the cannabis industry, and we're not terribly interested in creating regulation for it. And really, as other states started to advance, it became clear sort of the writing was on the wall, I guess, for those groups. And so there, in the last couple of years was a better opportunity to actually create a sort of consensus framework. And what came out of that with the Medical Cannabis Regulation and Safety Act was a system of dual licensing, where local governments are explicitly both given the power to ban all medical cannabis activity or to permit it. And in fact, if a business wants to operate from a jurisdiction, it has to get a permit from that local government to even go apply for the state when the state creates its licensing systems.
And this is pretty unique to California, right? Like, is Colorado going through like this disparate kind of county, city ordinance type thing? Or
so Colorado does have the sort of ban cities and counties, places that haven't allowed cannabis activity. It's interesting, sort of in looking at nationwide sort of comparison. Really, beyond just the cannabis issue, there's a difference of philosophy of states in terms of what local control exists there. So what kind of autonomy or authority a local government has. And so really in the sort of former Commonwealth East Coast states, there's a lot more sort of state power. So for example, in New York, in their permitting program, there was a county that wasn't even informed that there was about to be a licensee that was going to be granted within it. And, there was actually some controversy around that, but there, basically it was not sort of flowing through the local government first. As you go sort of into the South and then the sort of more frontier states, there's and that policy sort of in the Northeast is sort of called Dillon Rule, and this is kind of a nerdy political science thing, but it's basically a type of sort of balance of power between states and local governments. In the West, it's really a home rule sort of tradition where local governments, actually it's reflected in California's constitution and our whole political tradition of really giving local governments a lot of authority over place and manner of activity and the ability to regulate things. And so, that's sort of what led to, I think, that being a central component of our system. And so it is definitely, something that's not unique to California, but definitely in comparison to the East Coast is more acute here. And it's been turned into sort of a hallmark of our regulation system.
Well, and that's super interesting how that might impact startups, right? Like there's these delivery services that have different hubs and they're delivering to different addresses. People are trying to expand their businesses into different cities, and like there's transportation that occurs between those facilities. Like, is that considering that 215 was such a thin piece of paper, right? Is that all attempted to be fixed through AUMA and Prop 64?
Yeah, so definitely the patchwork of regulations from city to city and county to county is a real challenge. And to this point, it's really been a matter of like how even your business is organized and what kind of structure you use to conduct it. There's some controversy under current law about the permissibility of profit making, for example. And some local jurisdictions take a really, and this is, again, prior to the MCRSA, prior to the AUMA. We're talking about sort of Prop 215 and then this other law that I haven't referenced yet, but the only other major law really that dealt with this issue is Senate Bill 420, which created what's called the collective model. And just briefly, the collective model is really the main legal authority for any cannabis business currently operating. Like, even though we have the Medical Cannabis Regulation and Safety Act, the state licenses that will sort of be issued under it are not coming until 2018. So in the meantime, to be a legal cannabis business, it means being what's called a collective or a cooperative. And even what that means is unclear. It was undefined in the law, and it, really the law did not define what it meant. It said if you were a collective or cooperative, you'd be protected legally in your medical cannabis activity, but didn't say exactly what that meant. So some local jurisdictions say that has to be an entirely nonprofit organization. There can't be any evidence of, any sort of personal enrichment from it whatsoever. Whereas others, completely, don't really are not concerned with that particular interpretation and are, not scrutinizing the corporate structures of entities, are licensing entities that are more traditionally for profit. So there's huge spectrum, and that creates a lot of regulatory uncertainty for a business, right? And currently, because there's no actual license in hand that the state has, there's no state licensing system. If you're a business and you're driving cannabis product through a jurisdiction, and the local sheriff or whoever the local sort of law enforcement is, you get the wrong deputy on the wrong day, there's it can be really can lead to challenges, and we've seen some of the more prominent cannabis businesses that have arisen in California can run into some of these challenges with just sort of hostile local governments. Right. So I think what the new state framework does for medical, and then if AUMA passes as well, it sort of piggybacks off of that general thing, is it gives more certainty, and it will sort of make it very clear to local governments when a business is authorized and lawful under state law, and it, I think will resolve some of that uncertainty. Now, with that said, there still is a lot of deference to those local governments, and there will still be sort of the equivalent of dry counties or dry cities if they so choose. And so there's 482 cities, 58 counties in California. Each of them will have a lot of authority to have different policy. So that can be challenging as a business that's trying to scale across the state to keep up on all of the different nuances. Some jurisdictions, for example, delivery service you mentioned, may require all of the drivers to register, and may, hopefully the state will sort of normalize things like insurance requirements or things like that with its system. But, as in the current framework, it can very much vary. And some jurisdictions will exclude employees who have criminal backgrounds and others won't. And so how do you deal with, your own employees in terms of that? There's a lot of challenges, and this is just the beginning. The state framework is something that allows us to build off it, and I think really presents some challenges to this industry, to this community, but also a tremendous opportunity to have sort of unprecedented engagement and collaboration with local governments to make it work.
So let's talk about Prop 64 a little bit, because we're kind of edging up towards discussion about it. I know Troy Dayton on Facebook lately has been posting a lot about people that are opposing Prop 64 and trying to convince them that it's a bad idea to oppose it, and obviously we agree. We think Prop 64 isn't perfect, but it's better than what we have.
Right.
So, first of all, what are you seeing in terms of what do you think is going to happen?
Yeah.
And second, what are the consequences, both immediate consequences and long term for Prop 64?
Yeah. So it looks like Prop 64 is going to pass. The most recent poll by PPIC had it at 55%, which is down a little bit from one of their earlier polls, but still sort of in a relatively safe zone. Some other polls have, shown it a little bit lower in the low 50s. I haven't seen anything that shows it the yes trailing no in the vote. And generally there's strong support for legalization generally across the country. Actually, Pew just had a study that showed the highest number ever. 60% of adults in the U.S. in their poll showed support for ending cannabis prohibition. So it looks like Prop 64 is going to pass. There's strong support for legalization, and really, the average. And I think this is something that's interesting to me. The average person who's going to be confronted with this choice is just going to see Prop 64. Should we legalize adult use of marijuana? And it's, and the ballot summary is and we'll tax it, and that will lead to, hundreds of millions or $1 billion in taxes a year, and will save us on, law enforcement. And it's very, top level, 60,000 foot view in terms of how it's characterized. And I think that when you, look at it from that perspective, voters in California believe it's time to end cannabis prohibition, and I expect that that's what will happen. Now, in terms of the controversy, the details of it, it's a 62-page initiative, right? It's not, Prop 215 fit on the front of a piece of paper, Prop 64 does not. And it really, because of that, it attempts to create a lot of comprehensive regulation. And when you do that, there's obviously going to be winners and losers, and there's going to be sort of potential, debate about the efficacy of certain provisions in it. And so I think that's something that we've seen within the cannabis industry, within the cannabis movement, is sort of some question about sort of what the implications of it will be on some important details of sort of regulatory structure for the industry, and a couple other points that I'd be happy to discuss. You asked what will happen. So, I've said that I think it will pass. One thing that I can say clearly is that you won't wake up November 9th and be able to just walk into a dispensary and, without a medical recommendation, purchase cannabis from it.
That's a pretty popular question. We were just talking to one of our partners yesterday, and she was asking, how soon will I be able to do this? How, what's going to change? How quickly is it going to be?
Right. So you won't be able to do that. The reason for it is that adult use sales will only be able to be made pursuant to a commercial license that the Adult Use of Marijuana Act creates. And those licenses are not going to be made available by the state until at least 2018. So
we got some time.
So, I sort of mentioned that all the existing medical cannabis businesses are what are called collectives or cooperatives. One of the key principles of that concept is that cannabis is only going to patients to meet their medical need. And so it's not like a collective or cooperative business is just going to be able to start selling to non-patients. So, what does go into effect immediately, though, are a number of things. So first of all, there's a reduction in criminal penalties, associated with, a number of cannabis crimes. It doesn't eliminate, in a lot of instances, many crimes go from felonies to either wobblers, which means it could be prosecuted either as a felony or misdemeanor, or down to a misdemeanor. And then there are certain individual possession crimes, which are sort of currently an infraction. Like if you have under an ounce, it's not even a misdemeanor, it's an infraction, but that'll just be completely lawful under California law, up to an ounce of cannabis and 8 grams of concentrate. So, on November 9th, they're not going to ask how you got it, but if you possess it as an individual, that will be lawful sort of the next day. The other thing that, the criminal penalty changes or the legal changes, also will create things that might not be as positive as those reductions in penalties. For example, one of the controversial aspects of the Adult Use of Marijuana Act is that it says public consumption of cannabis will be an infraction punishable by a $250 fine, and that does go into effect immediately as well, which will potentially in some areas of the state a concern is that will result in sort of enforcement of ticketing of people trying to raise revenue and sort of target people who don't have a place to smoke cannabis other than outside or things like that. It's a problem we've seen in Denver, for example. So there's going to be challenges, and those sort of changes will happen overnight. Actually, right now there's a controversy of interpretation sort of going on and discussions at the state level. There's some parts of the tax structure, and changes in the tax structure may take effect immediately. So one thing Adult Use of Marijuana Act does is it preserves medical Prop 215 and the idea of a medical cannabis patient. That we're not doing away with that because we're allowing for adult use. But one of the distinctions that the law draws is that if you're a medical cannabis patient who doesn't just get a recommendation, but goes and gets a card that currently is voluntary from the county health department. It's a state ID card. You go take them your recommendation, give them some money. It's going to be $100, and then there's actually some means testing. If you're low means, then it will be free in certain instances. You have to go register it with the county. Currently, that program exists. But only 6,000 people have participated in it roughly in the state. Out of a rough estimate, we don't know exactly, 750,000 to 1 million patients broadly. So if you go get that card, which there hasn't really been a strong reason to because it's been voluntary to this point, going forward, you'll be eligible to not pay sales and use tax, which depending on where you are fluctuates between 7 point something percent and 10% in areas like here. So that arguably may go into effect immediately. So if you go to the county and go get your formal ID card from the state, you may, if dispensaries are aware of that change, be able to have not pay the sales tax. Now, there's some controversy around the interpretation of that, but the Board of Equalization which collects sales tax, has sent some emails to their list to that effect, basically saying that they interpret that tax reduction to be sort of potentially immediate.
Wow.
So
Okay.
Interesting. I don't want to put you on the spot, but I kind of want to circle back to the very first original question because we got away from it. And if you don't want to talk about particular counties in the Bay Area, that's fine,
right.
Particular jurisdictions. But if you do have anything to say about kind of locally, I would love to hear it.
Yeah. So, I apologize for that. Hopefully the
The conversation went in a good direction, and it was interesting. But
I understand. Yeah, I think the context could be helpful, but I'm happy to bring it back to that sort of more specific question. So, again, local governments, they're the gatekeepers, and they're in varying degrees of sort of putting together their own policies about how to allow cannabis businesses. The act passed in late 2015, about a year ago, and so we've had about a year where local governments have known that they need to adopt their own local regulations. And so some like Oakland, for example, was already working on, even before the state had actually formally passed the framework, actually working on creating permitting for that up the supply chain activity, the production. And so Oakland passed an ordinance in May that allows for sort of a theoretically unlimited number of permits for every category of business activity. There's 17 types of licenses, actually now 18, because the cottage cultivation license was added by the governor this year. Oakland allows theoretically for all of that to happen. Now there's some complications on implementation. In particular, there was certain provisions that were included in that ordinance seeking to address basically this issue that there's been in its unarguable disparity in enforcement of Oakland's cannabis prohibition laws. The statistics are disgusting and unacceptable. We're talking about a city with we're about 5 times the rate of cannabis enforcement against people of color than occurs against white folks in Oakland, and the rates of cannabis are equal, or even some evidence indicates white folks smoke more cannabis. And so, because of that, the city has sought to create a policy to sort of ensure that that the emerging legal cannabis industry, the permitted industry, reflects the diversity of the city and seeks to sort of remedy that historical injustice. The details of how they're going about doing that have been controversial because there's a lot of really important details when you're doing a policy like that. So Oakland's in a protracted conversation, which may be sort of reaching at hopefully a point where the city will be able to proceed with licensing. But at one point, it was sort of the head of the pack. Now there are some other jurisdictions that have sort of, I'd say, gotten ahead of it. So, for example, there's Richmond, which has created an ordinance that allows, again, also for an unlimited number of cultivation and manufacturing licenses in their industrial areas. It's an option. They have certain details in their sort of land use policy that make it a little more cumbersome to actually go get that license than Oakland system ultimately might be. The barriers to entry are a little higher. So I think and also the city has not really historically been terribly tolerant of cannabis activity. So it's definitely, hasn't, I think there's some pause before, for some folks before they go headlong into Richmond. Other places, though, like Sonoma County, and then in particular Santa Rosa within Sonoma County, has a policy that makes it very straightforward to go obtain certain of the license types. So really the limiting constraint in a lot of these places will be real estate. But there's definitely some jurisdictions who are starting to take an attitude that cannabis business activity should be regulated as a land use in the same way that any other industry should. Cities all of them already have what are called sort of general plans and zoning codes that say, this type of business activity is appropriate here or there. And so the ones that are really out ahead and leading on this, I think, are ones that have said, we're just going to add cannabis into that zoning code where we've already made the determinations because it's really not that different from industrial activity or commercial activity. And so, I've said a few of the different jurisdictions that are going there. I think that we'll start to see, really, there's this important deadline. So you need a local license by January 1st of 2018 in order to be able to continue operating while the state permits you when the state's permitting system stands online. So there really is this sort of very significant deadline. It's not that you will be completely excluded from eventually being a licensee, but the sort of transition and being able to continue operating during that transition really is predicated on getting that local approval by.
That's like 2
and
months
there's no
away.
real grandfather clause for people who, if there's rules are changing in local jurisdictions, there's no.
Yeah, there's not. So there some jurisdictions are trying to deal with it because the reality is, we have an estimated at least 50,000 cannabis farmers in this state. Thousands of other cannabis businesses, further down the supply chain from cultivation. And as I mentioned at the outset of the show, there was really, not much regulation whatsoever of that activity. So, the question is there a pathway that's being created for the existing businesses who are already providing medical cannabis in what is already a multi-billion-dollar economy in California? Is there going to be an on-ramp or a way for those businesses to come into regulation? I don't think there'll be grandfathering in the sense that they're just going to be there. And in fact, I know they will not just be allowed to continue as is with complete sort of disregard for the new regulation. But I think the smartest jurisdictions are creating a pathway and real incentives for those businesses to come into the regulated structure and not erecting arbitrary barriers for it, because I think that will accomplish most of the policy goals of legalization and regulation more. So, yeah, that's what I'd say.
In general, just Because it's right over here across the bay. What's happening with San Francisco?
Yeah, San Francisco's really doing some interesting things right now. So, it was one of the first jurisdictions in the entire state to permit dispensaries. It has sort of a widely known medical cannabis dispensary program that is sort of interesting and peculiar. So one of its biggest strengths is that it allows for theoretically unlimited number of dispensaries. There's not a cap. A lot of jurisdictions decide, we only want 5. I mean, how does a bureaucrat or a politician know the appropriate amount of, we don't cap pharmacies, we don't cap ATMs just because they have their own issues associated with, making sure that they're regulated appropriately. But a lot of jurisdictions go towards that direction. San Francisco does not. However, it has a very restrictive land use policy around the sort of green zone where the dispensaries can be located. They added a bunch of distance buffers from basically a huge number of quote unquote sensitive uses. You have to be 1,000 feet, shortest horizontal line. And so it really knocks out a bunch of the city. And then it's usually well over a year to get approval. And then at the end, ultimately, the planning commission can just say, enough people complained or didn't, like your application, or we had a problem with it. Sorry, we're not approving you. And so there's been for years look at reform of that program. The city of San Francisco created a legalization task force to try and get out ahead of what would happen with Adult Use of Marijuana Act. And that task force has done a lot of great work, I think, to look at how they can change that process to meet the sort of challenges and also the opportunities that's presented by legalization. And so there's a lot of interesting conversations happening about sort of potential tourism and how to best manage that as a city. And I think that you'll see, over the next year, some look at what to do with adult use. Interestingly, also, there's simultaneously a robust conversation. There's a group called the San Francisco Cannabis Licensing Group, which is,
which you're also a part of.
Yeah, I'm an advisor to that. Yeah, that group is focused on just creating the licensing for the non-retail sector in San Francisco. So basically the cultivation facilities, of which there are a number in San Francisco already in this quasi sort of gray area. They're acknowledged by the city, but they're not formally permitted in the way that the state will require. And so there's a attempt to try and formalize that process, and it's sort of well along the way. I think the stakeholders in the cannabis community in San Francisco are really starting to have really. It's been about 6 months plus now of engaging with the agencies that are developing the regulations. There's been a hearing before the supervisors, and there's really been engagement with even the potential incoming candidates to really build consensus around this. And I think there's an interesting movement in San Francisco to preserve some of the industrial manufacturing space and uses. And I think that there's a sort of consistency with this industry and the opportunity it provides, because it provides in a city which has clear affordability issues and all these social issues that you've heard about surrounding that. The cannabis industry jobs are ones that are well paying, have good benefits usually, and are also accessible to people who don't have necessarily the sort of type of credentials or education that sort of thrive in sort of a tech background or other things. And so I think there's a lot of support, interestingly, in San Francisco for the idea of preserving that. They have other companies that like to celebrate Timbuktu. Backpacks are made there, and they like the fact that those jobs are being created. And I think that there's a look at also having sort of SF-made cannabis. And so I think that that's moving along well and should be sort of hopefully coming into place in the sort of early part of next year.
Very cool.
Do you have any thoughts about, I know we're very California-centric for obvious reasons, but do you have any thoughts about the other states? California's not the only state that has cannabis on the ballot on November 8th. Do you have any kind of predictions or? Yeah,
that's tough. I was actually just hanging out with somebody who's on the Prop 64 campaign last night. There was sort of an event in another part of Oakland here to sort of just talk about Prop 64 as sort of an Oakland cannabis community thing. And one of the folks on the 64 campaign was saying that really all the other 4 states, so there's 5 that have adult use measures, and the other 4 are really coin flips at this point in time. And
then there's another 5 that are going medical, right?
Yeah, so there's also some medical ones. There's actually recently there was one of the Arkansas has one. They had 2 ballot measures, and one just got thrown out by the Supreme Court like yesterday. And so there's the question of exactly what's going to shake out, and there's some sort of question about what voters in those places will ultimately vote on. I can't say right now, what my prediction is as to if how many of those will pass. I think that I mentioned that Pew poll that showed just like broadly across the U.S., 60% of people support legalization. The difficulty is when you run an actual initiative, numbers tend to fall down from sort of the abstract support for an issue across issues. When you get into the specifics, the opposition can attack very particular provisions and things like that. And so we'll see where it shakes out. I think that it's interesting, New York Times and some of these other sort of national publications have kind of put out stories recently that like this election could be the sort of death knell of federal prohibition, if enough of these ballot measures win. At the same time, there's concern that if a lot of them lose, that could be spun as the voters of these states saw what these Colorado and Washington have done and didn't like it, so that proves the experiment failed. And so there is something at stake, I think, in these initiatives passing for just a broader federal and national context. And that's one of the things that I think for me personally really helps me clarify some of the details and concerns around particulars of a policy that can lead to some of that sort of squabbling about is this a good policy ultimately. That really there is a broader movement here, and I think that there will be ramifications based on how these votes go down for sort of just the broader federal context.
Yeah, and I imagine even an ill thought out, even if it's an ill thought out legalization measure in a state, if it's legalization and there's enough of them, and that eventually helps turn the tide federally, all of those quote bad pieces of legislation will kind of be overcome by events at some point. And it won't really
maybe we don't know how federal legalization will look. If it's
Right.
just a federal legalization could just be removal of federal prohibition and leaving it to the states. I mean, alcohol is largely a state regulated system,
Yep.
And then that could leave intact what the states have done and not supplant it. Or we could have a form of federal. It wouldn't even really. I mean, I would argue if it was legalization or not. But if we just rescheduled cannabis to 2 and it became preempted by federal pharmaceutical regulation, then you could see a complete erasure of or at
that
least
could really disrupt this industry in a not necessarily a good way.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it could be quite problematic. I mean, it would not basically none of the 25 states that have robust medical cannabis systems would be compatible currently with a Schedule II system. So, but at the same time, I will say that I don't ascribe to the sort of if it's legalization, no matter what, you have to support it mentality, because there are some extreme examples like Ohio, not this cycle, but last election cycle, voted on a measure that would literally had written into it a monopoly for the 10 wealthy backer groups they didn't name themselves like I'm the cannabis growers are of Ohio, but they put into the Constitution that only certain properties could be used to cultivate, which they had already owned or had options on.
Nice.
And so, that loss, thankfully though, this is one thing that I think an important point though. The media, the national narrative is maturing, and the loss in Ohio was largely understood to be a loss for monopolization efforts, rather than a loss for and a referendum on just cannabis legalization generally. And so, that's, I think, an important thing, that, there can be bad ways to legalize. And I think, for example, in California, there were actually efforts, even in the legislature, where they were considering as recently as 2014 potential statewide caps on licenses, in the dozens, and that would be very destructive economically. And I think it's important to, consider a lot of some of the fine details in considering whether it's a good form of legalization, but generally. I think that there should be a disposition towards legalizing, and it would, there are extreme examples like Ohio where, I would not have supported that, I didn't support, not that I didn't get to vote there, but, I thought that was very dangerous, the idea of, just giving away all production to, and writing that into a constitution.
That's a really good point. I mean, I think it does get complex, and we can all agree on it should be legal.
Right.
But it does, you have to make compromises and then really consider the consequences of what you're voting for when the details get revealed. So
yeah, absolutely. And, there's understandable, there's a lot of controversy. I think right now my Facebook has turned into this toxic dumpster fire of tribalism and bifurcation and polarization, and it seems like there's obviously been I mean, there's no people saying it's Bilderberg Group and the Monsanto New World Order takeover initiative, and then unfortunately I've seen some of the Yes on Prop 64 people also take a similar extreme position recently, where there's talk of blacklisting people who question if Prop 64 is good policy, or and their businesses and things like that, and talk about and are really dismissive of some of the concerns that I think are valid. Like the honest assessment of what Prop 64 is it's a fundamental change in how California deals with cannabis. Granted, the legislature started that with passing MCRSA and starting this. It's not like if Prop 64 fails, we're going to go back to this largely unregulated, informal gray area economy. We're already moving in another direction. But the transition away from what has been for 2 decades a very informal economy that has provided for the livelihoods of hundreds of thousands of people, and with a certain degree of legal protection under, again, that collective model, that's going to be disruptive. And there are there's going to be really unfortunate situations where I think people who they're not the image of the criminal sort of environmentally destructive grower, but just someone who happens to not have the technical water right that they need to be able to continue growing, or that just doesn't hear about the fact that they need to get an application. Up in Humboldt, you're going to have to get your application in by December 31st of this year, or else they're going to there was an environmental lawsuit. They need to do an environmental impact study. They settled it, and so basically they're going to, on December 31st, shut down applications in Humboldt and then study the environmental impact of it, and then only open up new applications after that. So far, 2,300 farms registered in Humboldt. There's probably at least 5 times that many in the county, if not more. And those were just people who registered as existing farms on like a 3-page form. And then there's actually a sort of more robust application that's due. And the last I heard, it was in the 300s that had applied. So there's and I don't even know if everybody up there is aware that the door is going to shut on December 31st. There's some people who have like a wait and see attitude, because this is a really radical change, and there is a lot of costs associated with coming into regulation. And I don't know, I guess the point there is just that this transition will result in real disruption, and that's glorified, I think, in some aspects of our society, but at the same time there's really going to be some situations that are really sad situations where it's people's livelihoods are potentially being jeopardized. So I think there's a real anxiety and a basis for that we need to understand, and hopefully not dismiss if we want to keep ourselves together as a community, and because there are going forward need to be efforts to make this all work. Like there's going to be decades, but even especially in the next couple of years, really important policy conversations about how all this gets implemented, and to become overly divided and trying to get it over the finish line and become tribalistic is going to, I think, make that all the more difficult. And we need to also recognize that the cannabis industry is not the only aspect of this. It's not the only faction contributing to these policies, or a stakeholder, if you will. And to the extent that our community is internally infighting and divided, there are others, the representatives of police and the sheriffs and the local governments, who are not so divided in that way. And it'll be important for us, if we want to make this work and be consistent with our vision for legalization, to hopefully try and mitigate some of this infighting, I think.
So really well put. I completely agree.
There's all these like imposed deadlines on fairly short time frames, and forcing all these people to apply. Like you're talking like tens of thousands of applications. We all know how fast local governments move. Like, isn't this going to be a huge bottleneck as far as processing applications and then like filing responses? And like, I don't know. I'm imagining like just this mushroom cloud coming out of local government.
No, totally. I mean, in Humboldt, they got so inundated that their staff at one point was saying that they had stress-related illnesses and were not going to be able to continue working with the volume of work unless they hired more people. And there's other examples where it does create a huge concentration of work up front. But with that said, the point of permitting fees in California, a permit fee is actually by law only related to the cost of implementing a program, and cities should be charging money for these applications and for the permits that will allow them to hire staff to then regulate and process these things. Now there will be sort of an uptick, or there will need to be sort of an onboarding to that, and it's difficult to hire people and build the capacity to deal with it. And so it will be a challenge for some places, but I think ultimately it will work out. And to the extent that we encounter challenges, that's sort of something that we have to work through collaboratively with these local governments. And there's been some innovative, ways to try and deal with these challenges where local governments have really decided to listen to industry and movement stakeholders. And I think that there are ways to navigate these challenges. And it's going to be a learning process for the state as much as it is, they're learning from us too. And I think that it's actually been heartening to me to see some of these state regulatory agencies. I think they have really made an effort they've gone around the state, held meetings that are open to the public for people in the cannabis industry and movement to come voice their concerns. And they, in my immediate experience, I've seen them learn and evolve and adapt their perspective based on the feedback they get. And I think that the people doing it generally are coming to it with an open mind, and to the extent that they may not actually be cannabis consumers themselves or really understand the culture themselves, have been respectful. And so that's been heartening to me. And I think that it'll be challenging in certain places. There's some places that are still in ban, they don't want to hear anything about it. And I think some will be dragging their feet. I mean, I went to school in Atlanta, Georgia, and they voted in Sunday alcohol sales while I was there. There was no sale of alcohol, and there's still dry counties in places. So it's there's going to be some places that don't take the opportunity that this new framework affords them. But it'll be something that'll be an interesting challenge to work through.
We will get through this together.
Yeah. Look, thank you for your time. Really, it's been an awesome discussion. I think it'll be very valuable to the people who watch it. What were we saying before? The dozens of viewers.
Oh, yeah, it does. Almost a score.
Yeah, almost a score of viewers. You're speaking somewhere next week. What is it?
We're actually hosting, so National Cannabis Bar Association is going to be doing a webinar on, we're basically for the attorney members largely. I'm not sure if you're not a member of the Cannabis Bar Association, how you can watch it. I can ask that question, but it's going to be about, what happens with Prop 64 if it passes in terms of the next day versus over time, and then a discussion of some of the actual details and mechanics of it. So I think that's coming up.
If you're a lawyer, go watch that.
National Cannabis Bar Association is a great little sort of organization to facilitate collaboration on these things. So
awesome.
Well, thanks again for coming in.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Thank you guys.
Alex Zavell, ladies and gentlemen.
Alex Zavell.
All right, thanks guys. We'll see you next week. All right, man.